It was around 2 a.m. when a driver named Mark got a ping for a ride from a dimly lit part of the city. He had just finished his last trip and was ready to head home, but figured he'd take one more passenger. The app showed an address on the outskirts of town, near some abandoned industrial buildings, which seemed a little strange, but not entirely uncommon. When Mark arrived at the pickup location, there was only one person waiting. A woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a long coat, despite the warm weather. She got into the back seat without saying a word, and didn't acknowledge Mark when he greeted her. Mark started driving, and the silence between them was unnerving. After about 10 minutes, he glanced at the rearview mirror and saw that the woman was staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. He tried to make small talk, but she remained completely silent, not even moving. The route she had requested was unfamiliar, and took him through some back roads and winding streets. Every time he checked the rearview mirror, the woman was in the same position, not moving, just staring. It wasn't until he took a sharp turn and looked back to check on her that he realized the back seat was empty. Panicked, Mark slammed on the brakes and checked the car thoroughly, but there was no sign of her. He pulled over and immediately canceled the ride, but the app still showed the destination as completed. He hasn't taken a ride in that area since. Sarah, an Uber driver, was nearing the end of her shift on a late Friday night. She got a ping to pick up someone from an old hotel that was known for being run down, but it was located in a decent area of the city, so she didn't think much of it. When she arrived, a man in his 40s with a weathered face and disheveled clothing stepped into the car. He gave her an address that was in a nearby neighborhood, but his demeanor was strange. He seemed agitated, frequently glancing over his shoulder, muttering things under his breath. When Sarah asked if he was okay, he only responded, "I don't want to be seen here." As they drove, Sarah noticed that the man's reflection wasn't showing up in her rearview mirror. She thought it was just the lighting, but when she checked again, his reflection was still missing. It made her heart race, but she didn't want to make the situation worse by freaking out. The man kept saying things like, "I shouldn't have come back," and "They're watching." Then, out of nowhere, he demanded that she pull over. He grabbed the handle to open the door, but stopped short. "I can't get out here. They'll find me." Before Sarah could respond, the man suddenly turned pale, looked around in a frantic way, and opened the door. As he stepped out, he turned and whispered, "Tell them I'm sorry." He vanished into the night, and when Sarah checked the back seat, there was no sign of him. The GPS showed the ride had ended, but the app also showed no destination. Sarah never picked up from that hotel again.
Darren had just finished picking up his last fare of the night and was driving home when he got a call for another ride. It was a short trip, so he figured he could squeeze it in. The passenger was located at a secluded park, and when Darren arrived, a young man in his early 20s got into the back seat. The man had a hoodie on, which he pulled over his head as he sat down. The ride began in silence, but Darren couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he drove through the city, he glanced at the rearview mirror, but couldn't see the passenger's face. The man was slouched down, almost as if he was trying to hide from something. Then suddenly, Darren's phone rang. The number was listed as unknown, but the voice on the other end was clear. "Get him out of your car. He's not who he says he is." The voice was calm but urgent. Darren asked, "Who is this?" But the line went dead. Panicked, Darren looked in the back seat, but the man hadn't moved. He kept driving, but the feeling of dread was suffocating. The phone rang again, this time with a different voice saying, "Get him out now, or you're next." Panicked, Darren looked in the back seat, but the man hadn't moved. He kept driving, but the feeling of dread was suffocating. The phone rang again, this time with a different voice saying, "Get him out now, or you're next." Terrified, Darren immediately pulled over and told the passenger to leave. The man didn't say a word, simply got out and walked away without looking back. When Darren checked the ride on his app, it showed the destination had been set to a location that didn't even exist. Darren called Uber support, but they couldn't find any trace of the ride, and the number that had called him was untraceable. He never took another ride after midnight again. Hannah had been driving for Uber for a few months, and she'd had her share of strange rides, but nothing like this. It started one quiet evening when a rider requested a pickup from a busy downtown area. She arrived to find a man in his 30s waiting by the curb, looking a bit nervous but friendly. The man introduced himself as Jason and seemed pleasant enough at first. He asked to be taken to a suburb on the edge of town. During the drive, they exchanged small talk, and he told her he was recently out of a bad relationship. He mentioned that he lived alone now and often felt like someone was watching him. It was odd, but nothing alarming at first. However, after a few days, Jason seemed to show up at the same places where Hannah was driving. He was there, standing by the curb, waiting for her. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Perhaps she had driven him to a few places he frequented. But then it became impossible to ignore. One evening, she picked up a new fare, and when she looked in the rearview mirror, there he was, sitting in the back seat. Jason didn't speak. He just stared at her, his eyes dark and hollow. She immediately stopped the car and told him to leave, but he just got out without saying a word. Hannah reported him to Uber, but when they checked the ride logs, no record of the trip existed. It was as though the entire interaction had never happened. Even stranger, after that incident, she started seeing Jason everywhere she went. Walking down the street, at coffee shops, even in the grocery store. He would always give her that same hollow stare, but when she tried to confront him, he would disappear into the crowd. Hannah moved to a new city shortly afterward and hasn't seen him since. Chris had been driving for Uber for over a year without any issues, but one night he picked up a ride that still haunts him. It was a late-night request, just past midnight. He drove to a remote area near a cemetery, not unusual for rides that come in at that hour. When he arrived, a man wearing an old military jacket and a cap got into the back seat. He didn't look out of place, but something about him seemed off. Chris greeted him, but the man didn't respond. He just stared out of the window, not moving, not saying a word. Chris didn't think much of it. Some passengers just prefer silence, after all. As they drove along, Chris noticed that the temperature in the car was dropping. He checked the AC, but it was turned off. The man still hadn't spoken a word. Chris's fingers started to tingle with a sense of dread, and he could feel his heart rate picking up. After a few minutes, the man suddenly said, "I'm sorry, but I can't go back there." Chris asked him where he wanted to go instead, but the man remained silent. Chris looked in the rearview mirror and froze. He saw the man staring at him with vacant, hollow eyes. When Chris turned around to ask him if everything was all right, the man was gone. The back seat was empty. Chris slammed on the brakes and checked the entire car, but there was no sign of him. His app showed the ride as completed, but the map location was strange. It pointed to the cemetery. The next morning, Chris went to the cemetery out of curiosity. He found a headstone with the same name as the man in his back seat, dated to the 1940s. He hasn't worked late shifts since,